Thank you everyone for being here for TERN's webinar, ensuring a net zero future and protecting our biodiversity. The first thing I want to do is to acknowledge our traditional custodians throughout Australia and all nations. And we do honour their connections to land, water, biodiversity and culture, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And today I'm joining you from Jubugai country, which is in the rainforest in far north Queensland. And thank you for joining us today. I think most of you have met me, but for those who haven't, my name is Beryl Morris and I'm the Director of TERN, Australia's Ecosystem Observatory. This is our first webinar for this year. I'm just having difficulty getting my slides to move. So first of all, I thought I'd tell you that TERN is national research infrastructure. Our role is to provide that world-class research infrastructure that helps researchers monitor and understand changes to our environment and climate and enable predictions of future risk. We are very much a federation of a lot of organisations. We're funded by the Australian government under an NCRIS grant, and we have a growing number of partners throughout Australia and throughout the world. And we're part of the global ecosystem research infrastructure that pulls together similar monitoring of the environment that happens at a continental scale across the world. So just moving on, I'd like today to introduce you to our amazing speakers. I know that you get tired of hearing that word amazing, but these people really are amazing. You've got their biographies, so I'm not going to go into them in any great detail, but we're going to hear in this order from Dr. Tanya Doody, who's the group leader managing water ecosystems in CSIRO. Tanya's focus for many years has been on quantifying water consumption by forests and invasive species and understanding the importance of that water for Australia's biodiversity. We also have Peter Isaac, who's the project manager for TERN's Ecosystem Processes platform from James Cook University. Peter researches carbon and water fluxes in terrestrial ecosystems to support Australia's net zero and carbon emissions goals, and he is our expert on fluxes. And we are delighted to have with us today Chris Cosgrove, Director of Sustenance Asia, who has been leading agri-food sustainability for some time now, with a lot of practice across a lot of agricultural sectors. So I would encourage you, as you listen to the speakers, to submit your questions via the Q&A button, and we'll provide the answers to those at the end of the webinar. And I'm going to stop sharing now and ask Tanya Doody to take us away. Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you, Beryl. I'll just work at sharing. Okay. And then hopefully you can now see my talk. Is that okay, Beryl?
Unmute. Yes, that all looks good to me. There's just something at the bottom.
Wonderful.
Hide.
Oh,
yeah.
But thank you.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So today what I'd like to talk about is, for me, the importance of field data collection in order to develop spatial models to inform catchment water management so that we can monitor biodiversity values, ecosystem functions across multiple scales. Of course, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors to the research I'll talk about today. And also, I'll actually go back here, just acknowledge that this research was primarily done within a decade-long project called FLOMER, which is a flow monitoring, evaluation and research project aimed at understanding how to use environmental water across the Murray-Darling Basin. So, of course, the context for this talk is the Murray-Darling Basin. So for those of you outside of Australia, sorry, my wellbeing break is going to keep popping up. For those of you outside of Australia, the Murray-Darling Basin is in southeastern Australia, and it takes up 1 million square kilometres of the basin of Australia. It's home to Australia's two largest rivers, the Murray and the Darling, of course. But of course, it is also a highly modified river system since the 1900s. And this is due to the installation of locks, dams and weirs and barrages in order to provide secure water resources to sustain agricultural products across the basin. The Murray-Darling Basin, which I will refer to as the basin more often than not, is the food bowl of Australia. However, it does also still maintain high biodiversity values and unique ecosystems. So nationally, there are over 100 important wetland areas, but also internationally, there are 16 Ramsar wetlands. And so it's really important that we have tools to help us monitor across this massive land area. So particularly in the last 30 or 40 years, there has been over-extraction of water in the Murray-Darling Basin, and this is combined with some significant droughts. 2000 to 2010, we had the Millennium Drought, and this has, of course, led to significant ecosystem decline, and I'll have some photos of that in the next screen. So what we've been doing within the Murray-Darling Basin at a national level and a state government level is working out how to manage water to ensure a balance between human use, but also sustainable ecosystems to maintain our biodiversity values. My talk today is focused on two tree species within the Murray-Darling Basin. They are iconic species, both eucalypts. Up the top there, we have the black box tree and also the very iconic river red gum tree. So it has been noted that vegetation, particularly trees, are a water user, and therefore they do have water requirements. But up until more recently, when I started to undertake water balance studies within the Murray-Darling Basin in the last 15 years, it's been relatively unknown how much water they need and when they need it. So today's talk focuses on measurement of transpiration, but primarily incorporating that in a water balance approach to understand evapotranspiration from these tree ecosystems. So as I mentioned, there has been decline. So river red gum, which are shown in these two photos here, when they're on a riverbank, they require to have a flood every 1 to 2 years. Once you're getting to 3 to 4 years, the leaves will start to drop off and you'll start to get some pretty significant decline in tree health. By the end of the Millennium Drought in around 2009, only 30% of trees across the entire basin were in good condition. So one of the ways that we've been working within the basin to arrest that decline is to apply environmental flows, because healthy ecosystems are absolutely critical to sustain these biodiversity values. So I just wanted to show a quick example, particularly for our international viewers, of a method to imply some environmental flow. So this is a pump. It's come a really long distance, maybe 10 kilometres from the Murray River itself, to provide water to this very isolated wetland that hasn't had any water allocations for many years. The purpose of this is to provide water for the trees. You might have seen the birds flying around, but also all those other organisms that are attracted to areas of water, which is also related to those biodiversity values and having a lot of variability in the, the animals and the flora that are there. However, a key knowledge gap with this understanding of tree water use is that we don't understand their water requirements spatially and temporally, particularly in unmonitored areas, which is most of that 1 million square kilometres. So my aim and that of my team has been to develop some tools that help to inform water management. In this instance, it's to inform application of environmental water and prioritising of environmental water, but I'll talk about some other management implications a little later on. Ultimately, we want to ensure that ecosystems are protected. So the overarching objective here was to develop effective spatial temporal tools that will help assist in broad-scale landscape and water management decisions, but across multiple scales, from local to catchment to basin. I'll provide a snapshot of the model development. So like us, trees require water. Today, I'll talk about evapotranspiration, but that actually relates to water stress. So when we see high ET, which is evapotranspiration, we're talking about low water stress. As trees are running out of water, they'll have low ET, or evapotranspiration, which is indicating high water stress. So this is providing a means for us to try to understand, using these spatial tools, how trees are tracking their water stress over time and over several decades. Now, we've done this by undertaking this field data, combining that with a really critical spatial evapotranspiration data set, which is actually hosted by the TERN, called the TERN ET, and we'll talk about that one a little bit more as well, and using machine learning to bias correct that TERN ET data set to turn it into a tree-specific data set, whereas currently that ET is representing the entire ecosystem. And our outcome is this riverine tree spatial model. It's a 30-metre data set, pixel resolution. We have monthly outputs, and it's from the year 2000 to 2022. And this is exactly the same data period, temporal and spatial, as that of the TERN ET, because we've bias corrected that data. What we're doing is providing a basin coverage of evapotranspiration for both red gum and black box. So really quick overview, the field data, what we do is collect sap flow or transpiration, which is water moving through the tree using sap flow sensors. We collect soil evaporation and also canopy interception, and collectively that information gives us plot evapotranspiration, which is really important for that bias correction that I'll talk about. We also calculate rainfall in an open area. There's journal papers that present all these methods, so please feel free to have a look at those. So what the next step was, once we had 22 sites across the Murray-Darling Basin, multiple years of data, with evapotranspiration collected at 3 weekly or 6 weekly intervals, we were able to use that field ET to then bias correct that Somerset or TERN ET. So the TERN ET product was developed by CSIRO and is often also referred to as Somerset Lancer ET. But for simplicity today, I'll just call it TERN ET. We use machine learning. Again, there's a journal paper that will cover that. But basically what we get is outputs at that 30-metre resolution, which is giving us tree evapotranspiration, which has a 92% match to the field evapotranspiration that we use to bias correct the TERN ET product. So why is this important? So within the remit, particularly of the Flow MER program, which funded all of this, is understanding the benefits of environmental water at a basin scale. It's really hard to understand anything at such a large scale. So trees are fantastic for large scale because they don't move. So the product we developed, we called AMLET for the Murray-Darling Basin wetlands, and that's Australian Machine Learning Evapotranspiration for Trees. What I have here is a figure, just one snapshot of 1 month in 2020. So imagine this same snapshot for every month over 22 years. What this is telling me, if I'm a catchment manager or a water manager, or I need to prioritise environmental water, is that in this area with the green oval, we have low water stress, which means there's high ET, as represented by the yellowy and green scale in the legend below. However, as we move north, it's been an area where they've had less rainfall, ET is very low, and therefore there's some really high water stress. If I'm a water manager, I want to keep an eye on that particular area over the next months, seasons, years, depending on the trends that have come beforehand, in order to understand how those trees are, if they're starting to decline, biodiversity is declining, and the ecosystem functions are declining. Taking this down to another scale, so I've talked about basin scale, but we also have floodplain scales at which we also need to understand this information. So what we did here was just produced a couple of little models. This is still the 30-metre pixel. We've done annual evapotranspiration for 2 different floodplains. I'll get them going as I talk. Yep, that one's going. Oops, sorry. Hopefully they're going to go. One's going to go. Okay, so this is cycling through. Red is areas of high stress, green is areas of low stress. And so what this is helping to tell floodplain managers is that over time, there are some key areas that are really starting to decline. So if we look at this one over on the right again, I'm just running through it again. So the blue is areas of flooding. Where there's no blue around, generally we have more stress. When there's blue, it's indicating that the trees have water and that the trees are in low stress. Management implications from this development of this product. So what we've done is provide 22-year trends with monthly data of tree water stress related to the amount of water available to the trees. Again, 30-metre pixels, red gum, black box across the Murray-Darling Basin. And here we have a snapshot of some images of trees with low water stress. So this is where ecosystem function is really nice. The trees are probably fluctuating between states of high and low water stress as they should do. And the right-hand picture is showing high water stress. One thing I should have noted probably earlier is that these floodplains are really highly dynamic. So they shouldn't always be in low water stress. They shouldn't always be in high water stress, but they should fluctuate because we do need the trees to drop leaves. That produces food. Flood comes, that goes into the water bodies and provides food for food webs. In terms of a monitoring tool, it's possible to now pull out these time series for pixels. So what these graphs are showing here, the top graph is, say we had a threshold of about 500 millimetres per year of evapotranspiration. That's what, if trees remained above that 500 millimetres a year over, we've got a 20-year time period there, then we don't need to worry about those trees too much. They've got low water stress, high evapotranspiration. However, that bottom graph is showing that these trends are quite a lot under that 500 millimetre a year. We really don't like these red gums to be more than 5 years without water. So if I'm a water manager or I'm prioritising environmental flows, I'd be thinking about how I might get environmental water to those sites. I will note that bottom graph, those 2 big peaks are related to large flooding in 2010 to 2012 and also flooding in 2016. So the green thumb is, yep, that time series for that pixel in that floodplain, those trees look good, no need to bother. The bottom pixel, if that's my floodplain, I'd be thinking about how I might prioritise environmental water. So another way to use this data is for improved water accounting estimates of vegetation water losses as well, and an improved understanding of ecological response to water management. This helps inform future focused predictions of environmental water requirements underpinned by climate scenarios. Why do we do this? Like I said, these trees should be dynamic, fluctuating between high water stress, low water stress. When we're in that dynamic situation, we maintain and we actually enhance biodiversity values, which are shown in this mosaic of the different easily identifiable pieces of biodiversity across the Murray-Darling Basin. This then makes sure ecosystem functions are good, but we're also providing that amazing social amenity for people, but also balancing water for irrigators. So also many people I'd like to acknowledge in undertaking this research as well. And any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
So Peter, you'll...
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you, Beryl and TERN for running this webinar. I'm going to talk on carbon budgets in Australian ecosystems. Tanya's done a really good job of talking about water, so I hope that I can give just as good a job in talking about the other side that interests us in carbon. There's myself, and then there's a whole list here of the usual suspects from TERN Ecosystem Processes and Ausflux, all of whom have contributed in one way or another to this presentation. I'm going to leap right in with the global carbon budget, just so that we get people familiar with some of the terminology that I'll be using throughout the talk. Before that, though, I want to bring people's attention to the two plots in the top right-hand corner. I'm sure you've all seen these before, but we'll just go over them again. The top one is from CSIRO, that's methane, CO2, and nitrous oxide over the last 2,000 years, showing the dramatic increase since the Industrial Revolution. And the one below that is from the Bureau, 1910 to the present day, mean temperature anomalies, showing that Australia has warmed by about almost 1 degree over the last 110 odd years. So that's what we're dealing with, and that's why we're interested in carbon. This warming, we believe, is driven by anthropogenic emissions of CO2. To the global carbon cycle, not going to worry about the ocean side of things here because we're particularly focused on the terrestrial biospheres. And what I wanted to draw people's attention to are two things. Firstly, the stores of carbon in this plot are shown in white, and the numbers are in gigatons of carbon. And the fluxes, or the transport of carbon between stores, is shown in yellow, and those numbers are in gigatons of carbon per year. And the first thing I wanted people to see is that the soil carbon is a very large store. That's 2,300 gigatons of carbon. But the flux from the soil to the atmosphere is only 60 gigatons of carbon per year. So compared to the size of the store, the flux is relatively low. In contrast, when we look at photosynthesis and biomass, there's only about 550 gigatons of carbon stored in the biomass, but the photosynthetic transfer, or the photosynthetic uptake of that vegetation is around 120 gigatons of carbon per year. That's much, much higher proportion of the store than we see for the soil. So this might lead us to expect that soil turnover of carbon could be relatively slow, vegetation probably fairly quick, just based on the size of the fluxes to the available stores. For the terrestrial carbon budget, which is where we'll spend, or I'll spend my time today, we normally take a fairly simple approach when we're dealing with natural or native ecosystems. Carbon uptake is just the difference between photosynthesis, carbon being taken out of the air by the process of photosynthesis, and respiration. Written down, net ecosystem productivity is just the difference between gross primary productivity and ecosystem respiration. We're ignoring a bunch of stuff here: disturbance, herbivores, storage, etc. A whole lot of terms we're ignoring. That's a simple approach. When we start looking at managed ecosystems, it gets a bit more complicated. Now, carbon uptake will be above ground biomass, below ground biomass, whatever's been removed by grazing, whatever's taken out by litter fall, whatever's stored in the soil, and whatever's being taken off by respiration. And now we have to start looking at animal respiration as well as just plant and microbial respiration. So there's a lot more information going into carbon budgets in managed ecosystems. We're still ignoring disturbance and long-term geochemical processes in that managed ecosystem, but we're starting to take account now of herbivores and storage. This requires more information. Land management practices, stocking rates, stock rotation, fertilizer application, all of those things, additional information we're going to have to get from somewhere. The little box down the bottom right-hand corner comes from Vanessa Harvard study in 2013, which I thought I'd pop up just to remind us all. She found 67% of Australia's NPP, that's net primary productivity, came from recurrent or grassy vegetation. And 1/3, 33%, comes from the persistent or woody vegetation. So these managed ecosystems are very important in terms of Australia's net primary productivity budget. Interestingly, she found that the interannual variability, so the difference between years, was roughly the size of the anthropogenic emissions for Australia. That was really interesting. So a lot of variability, and the variability is about the same as the anthropogenic emissions. And lastly, the variability is dominated by desert, semi-arid, and savanna ecosystems. How do we measure these terms? Top right, I just wanted to remind people we're dealing with stores of quantities, in our case, stores of carbon, and the transfer of a quantity or transfer of carbon between those stores, and that's what we call the flux. For the exchange of carbon between the surface and the atmosphere, we're calling that net ecosystem productivity. It's the difference between uptake by photosynthesis and the loss by respiration, and flux towers are pretty good at measuring net ecosystem productivity. For stores of carbon, now we're having to start dealing with above ground biomass, what's been taken off by herbivores, what's been harvested, etc. And we get to these numbers in forested ecosystems by doing direct measurements of tree size. In pasture systems, we've got to do sampling over 1 square meter quadrats. But now we also need to know something about grazing patterns and litter traps in order to get an idea of what's happening to the above ground biomass. Below ground, roots, microbial respiration, this starts to get really difficult to measure. They're often inferred from the amount of above ground biomass. When we get to soil carbon, relatively easy to measure. The analysis is not difficult, but the sampling is tricky. And I'll show some examples of why that is later on. And we then have to start dealing with carbon that might be in fast pools. It'll get recycled to the atmosphere quickly, or slow pools, it'll be locked away. Either way, sometimes we just measure the fluxes and infer the changes in the stores. Sometimes we measure the changes in the stores and infer the fluxes. And occasionally we get to do both. Very difficult, but very important. Photograph on the right-hand side is Lindsay Hutley stuck in a soil pit. It's probably about 38 degrees and 95% humidity, and Lindsay's not looking terribly happy. Sometimes gathering information from these soil pits on below-ground biomass and so on is just plain hard work. And lastly, an acknowledgement to Liam Grace for saying something that I'd never thought of before. Flux towers are prone to systematic errors, so they're prone to biases. Sampling methods, like soil sampling for carbon, are prone to random errors. So I just thought I'd put that up because that's a very interesting statement. What about the Australian flux tower networks? The big map in the center there is the TERN Ecosystem Processes and Ausflux tower network. We've got about 24 active sites. As you can see, mostly concentrated in the Northern Territory and down the eastern seaboard, with a few more in Western Australia. Big gap in the middle, except for Jamie Cleverly's sites at Alice Springs, Mulga and Tea Tree East. Queensland University of Technology have got a sustainable agricultural program running. They're heading towards 23 active towers. We're getting a bit nervous because they might put another one in soon and get to 24, and then they'll be equal to us. So we'll have to keep sharpening up our game. So we've got a fairly big network across Australia. Top left-hand picture there is Lindsay up a tower this time instead of down a pit, and that shows you the basic layout of instrumentation at the top of one of our flux towers. And on the right-hand side is a picture of one of QUT's, or Queensland University of Technology sites, sitting in a pasture somewhere in Queensland. So, fairly good network. Typical results from the flux towers. Now, the thing I wanted people to focus on here are the two plots on the left-hand side and the second one on the right-hand side, the multicolored, colorful-looking plots. Going from left to right for each of those, it's net ecosystem productivity, gross primary productivity, ecosystem respiration, and then evapotranspiration that Tanya was talking about before. And the contrast that I wanted people to see here was that for Tumbarumba, which is a temperate forested site in the Great Dividing Range, it's just out to the west of Canberra, that's a fairly regular cycle, seasonal cycle of carbon uptake and water loss. Right? It's pretty regular. If we look at the Alice Springs Mulga site, it's anything but regular. This is an extremely dynamic site driven by intermittent episodic rainfall events. The importance of this is that for something like Alice Springs Mulga, we're going to have to sample over a long period of time to get a statistically stable estimate from all of those episodic pulses. So the type of ecosystem makes a difference. Length of record is critical. Plot in the middle is cumulative NEP, top left-hand corner there for Calprum site. It's recovering mallee. And what I wanted people to get from this was that there's a big range in net ecosystem productivity summed over a year, from something around about 0 all the way up to close to 300 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. That's 3 tons per hectare. Right? So a huge range, again, driven by interannual rainfall variability. The blue line, I think it's blue because I'm colorblind, 2014, that was a fire that went through the Calprum site, and you can see that for most of that site, that was a net source of carbon, not a net sink. In terms of carbon stocks in woodlands, the top left-hand plot that we've got here is for a Cumberland Plains site. which is a remnant native vegetation in New South Wales out to the west of Sydney, run by Western Sydney University. And what I've plotted up here in the blue line is biomass, above ground biomass, based on measurements of basal area of the tree and the tree height. The red line is net ecosystem productivity off the tower, and the yellow line is evapotranspiration off the tower. And what's fascinating here is that really for the first 3 samples that we've got here, the tower and the above ground biomass measurements or inventory methods agree pretty well. Then there's a substantial difference and they gradually recover over time. Pulling that apart, the first part of this time series is dominated by a mistletoe infestation that just simply got worse. There was then a strong drought in 2018, 2019, and 2020 was the recovery period. Now, the problem here is that the towers or the inventory methods, of the towers, they're measuring what's happening to individual trees, whereas what the tower is seeing is an average across the entire ecosystem. So we can expect to see some big differences where processes might be changing between the entire canopy and what might be happening for an individual tree. It's very labor intensive getting those measurements. Down the bottom, courtesy of Stefan, is a point cloud for Wombat State Forest, I think it is, taken by a leaf scanner. And the panels on the right-hand side are similar images, but just done as a panorama for 3 sites in Western Australia with differing rainfall amounts. Now, we're starting to get to the point now where, not necessarily with this instrument, but with a more accurate instrument, we can start to recover above ground biomass in a more automated fashion, so we can get the numbers more frequently and not spend as much time getting them. In terms of carbon stocks in pasture systems, this is from some work being done by Queensland University of Technology in pasture renovation. You can see the starting point in that photograph on the left-hand side. There's almost no biomass there at all. The next plot over is after 2.5 years. And then the other 2 plots are the soil sampling on the back of a ute and a map of the cores that they've had to take. For the plots left to right, we've got above ground biomass over the 2.5-year period of that pasture restoration. It goes from about 1,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare all the way up to almost 6.5. But the interesting thing is the amount of scatter in the circles. So although there's 8 samples there, we can get an average for each one of them. Any one of the particular soil cores that's been done has got can cover a very, very large range. So the uncertainty in some of these numbers is quite big. They've also got grazing rates from a digital method where they know the number of beasts going through the gate into the paddock, and then they can assume a steady takeout or a steady amount of consumption by each beast. We get to about 2,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare with the grazing. And on the right-hand side, soil carbon, the one that everybody's talking about, there's a modest increase in soil carbon over that 2.5-year study period associated with a very big increase in biomass. But again, there's a large range in each of those surveys. So the uncertainty is quite large in the numbers. Now to look at disturbance. The video that you can see down the bottom is a clearing that took place at the Red Dirt Melon Farm, not far from Katherine in the Northern Territory. Took over a day. The plot on the left-hand side is net ecosystem exchange in the red line for the cleared site. The clearing was done around about March of 2012 during the wet season. And we can see that when the clearing happened, there was a large pulse of CO2 back out to the atmosphere. Then as the fallen vegetation was left to dry out and cure, the site continued respiring. And when they burnt it all at a big fire, there was a massive pulse of respired carbon dioxide that went out to the atmosphere. And then after that, you can see where they've started to get some regrowth after the start of the next wet season. And then they've plowed it back in again, ready to start planting melons after that. In total, that entire process released about 165 megagrams of CO2 equivalent per hectare, which is equivalent to around about 100 years of undisturbed savanna uptake. So that one event was extremely expensive in terms of carbon loss to the atmosphere. For other greenhouse gases, so far I've only talked about CO2. A lot of work has been done by Stefan group from University of Melbourne, and now Peter Grace's group from Queensland University of Technology. The general setup is shown in the pictures on the right-hand side, a large bunch of chambers set out across a field. They can be triggered to work automatically. Most of that sampling, they're still fairly labor intensive to run though. It's difficult to get individual data points. In terms of results, this one on the left-hand side, time series from the Howard Springs Tropical Savanna site, just outside of Darwin. Not much happening in nitrous oxide, but then it's not an agricultural site. In an agricultural site, we'd expect to see a lot more variability in the nitrous oxide. A little bit happening in methane. The particularly important one is not quite visible on this plot here, but there was a peak flux of around about 131 micrograms of carbon per meter squared per hour coming out just after a fire. So it tells us that methane emissions can be very high just after a fire. And the bottom line is CO2 tells us what we probably already knew, which is that the CO2 flux out of the soil is primarily dependent on soil moisture. But we can do non-CO2 greenhouse gases. Now, the second to last slide that I've got here is a courtesy of Queensland University of Technology, and I'm extremely grateful to Ella de Wilde and Dave Rawlings for permission to use this. But they did a survey across 23 organizations from less than 20 employees up to more than 200 employees. And they were collecting or gathering opinions on what are the problems with collecting data for sustainability and what are the problems with the existing data. And the things I wanted to point out here was that one of the main ones in terms of collecting data was farmer engagement. So these people are already flat out working for a living, and then we're asking them to provide extra data. That's going to be a problem. It may be that timely provision of information useful for their practical decision-making would help. And it may be that there are too many voices yelling at these people as well. So we might need to be a bit more cautious in how we approach and what we say to them. Obviously, cost is a factor. Interestingly, lack of a common language came out as a strong problem. Hardly surprising. They're in the practical world, we're in the research world. Sometimes we will use different vocabularies. In terms of the existing data, and this is where TERN, I think, has got a really important role to play, poor data quality and lack of verification. That's something that TERN has worked on extensively with its own data sets. Perhaps we've got a role to play here in helping others. No regional context. So there may be a study done, but it's somewhere else in Australia, not applicable to the farmer's own area. And again, lack of a common language. So I think we really have to work on having a common language between researchers and practical users of the information. Take-home messages I want people to get from this presentation today. Carbon cycles are important, both in native and managed ecosystems. Some of those components are difficult and labor-intensive to measure, but we can get there. Carbon budgets for managed ecosystems need a lot of additional information. That means we're going to have to engage with the land managers to get that information and make sure we provide some return for provision of that extra work. Flux towers can measure net ecosystem productivity. They can do it quite well. Independent measurements, such as above ground biomass surveys, are very useful for verification. Lastly, we've got to continue moving towards automation of data collection, because the more we can automate that process, the less people we're going to need and the less money it's going to take to run us. And finally, we have to continue talking to both stakeholders and practitioners to encourage both a common language that came through in that QUT survey, but also common measurement standards as people get into the carbon budget area. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And I'll throw to Christopher Cosgrove.
Thanks very much, Peter. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Peter and Tanya. Thank you, TERN, and g'day everyone. I'm a sustainability consultant specialising in agri-food. One of my clients is the Australian cotton industry, and my role is to help the industry manage its sustainability framework, which we call Planet, People, Paddock, or environmental, social, and economic. So in Australia, pretty much every agricultural industry has a sustainability framework. And like businesses anywhere, those frameworks aim to identify what's most important, to manage them, and to measure progress and impacts. The difference between these industry sustainability frameworks, a cotton or a beef or a dairy, etc., sustainability framework, and the framework and the frameworks or programs that individual companies have, is that we operate at an industry scale. And that has some important differences. First is that the data we have is generally coarser and not as good because we're talking a lot of area, and getting data, particularly in social and environmental stuff, is really difficult, as you all know. Secondly, because we're working at an industry level, we have no control, we have no ownership over the thousands of individual farm businesses that make up our industry. So we can point out the risks and opportunities, we can influence action, but we have no control. And in effect, the annual numbers that we put out is an aggregate or an average aggregate of all the decisions that those thousands of farm businesses take. And thirdly, and the really cool thing and the big opportunity is that because we're working at an industry scale, there is a huge opportunity for positive impact if we get it right. And I'll talk to you more later about some of the work we're doing in terms of actions. When it comes to needs, and this is really following on from Peter's last couple of slides, what I think we all need collectively is to be much more coordinated and collaborative in how we measure impacts and get that data to farmers, but also to other data users in the form that they need. You know, there's so much duplication and inconsistency in sustainability. There's so much duplication and inconsistency in agriculture. When you bring that in to have duplication and inconsistency in agriculture and in sustainability, and also coming from banks and from customers and from financial institutions and from governments and other sources, then all that noise for farmers becomes this howling gale. And what do we do when there's a howling gale? We turn our back to it and huddle from it and hope it blows over. So if we want farmers to take action and other land managers to take action, and I know we do, then I think we have to be much clearer and kinder and get this data to farmers and others in a way that they can make sense of. And again, I'll talk later about some of the work we're doing. So Cotton 101, the Australian cotton industry has been around since about the 1960s. Cotton is a summer crop. All parts of the crop are used when they're harvested. About 40% by weight, or about 85% by value, sorry, is a fluffy white stuff called cotton lint, which goes to make white fluffy things like the shirt I'm wearing. It's not a massive industry economically, financially, but it's pretty significant. On average, about $2 billion Australian per year. The last couple of years, when there's been lots of rain in Australia, it's been a $5 billion industry. It is, though, particularly important to the individual farms in terms of their whole farm business and whole farm resilience, and really important because it's a pretty high value crop and high value services, really important to those regional areas where cotton is grown. I can't talk about Cotton 101 without talking about water. So there is a fairly widely held perception that cotton uses excessive amounts of water, which is incorrect, I think. Because cotton is a summer crop, it grows in hot and dry conditions. When you add water, either from the rain or from irrigation, then it really flourishes. Now, in Australia, you can only add water from irrigation when it's made available to you by the governments. So all the state governments regulate water. And as Tanya mentioned before, in the past, there's been over-extraction. There is currently, or has been for several years, regulations in place aiming to provide sustainable withdrawals of water. So the basic needs of the environment and people need to be met before any waters are made available for other uses, including for irrigators. So getting that balance right that Tanya spoke about is really important. And the role of those sustainable diversion limits that governments regulate aims to do that. When farmers, or if farmers who have a license to get water are actually given any water in a year, and the amount they get varies from year to year depending on the season, then they choose what to do with it. Every farmer I know chooses to do two things: to apply that water to the crop which will give him or her the greatest economic return, and also to be as efficient as possible with this water, which is just so precious, as we all know. And you can see here that in the past 30 years, the Australian cotton industry, by the dotted green line there, which is the average area planted, has hardly changed. But the average amount of cotton picked from that land, which hasn't changed, which is the dotted orange line there, has gone up by about 80% in the past 30 years. So all of that, I'm telling you, is to say that the Australian cotton industry's approach to water and water use directly aligns to the UN Sustainable Development Goal target 6.4, which is for significant increases in water use efficiency within sustainable water withdrawal limits. So I think, in my view anyway, the Australian cotton industry has significantly improved water use efficiency, and the regulations in Australia aim to provide sustainable withdrawals. So that's Cotton 101. Just quickly, Sustainability 101. You're all obviously focused on the environment, which is really important, but I just make the point that creating sustainable societies and creating sustainable economies, to me, are just as important. They're the three pillars, the three legs of the sustainability stool as environmental value. This is a definition that comes from the AA1000 accountability principles. In my mind, that's the best global framework for managing sustainability. Sustainability as a whole, it's a strategic process. So myself, other companies, other industries, when we're looking at sustainability, will follow a very logical and powerful process, starting with looking to identify who are our stakeholders, who do we impact or who impacts us, and increasingly including them in our decision-making processes. You can't manage everything and you can't keep everyone happy. So the second step is to assess what's most important or what's most material. So come up with a short list of things that are most important to your ongoing success. Manage those important things appropriately, and then measure impact and progress, and then go back and tell your stakeholders how you're going. My definition of this, there's lots of definitions, but when I talk to business leaders primarily, rather than to environmentalists and others who are interested in the sort of definition that it's about sustainability is about meeting your own needs without compromising the needs of future. If you're a CEO, you really want to know, well, that's nice, but how can I justify this to my stakeholders or to my shareholders right now? And to me, the power of this model is that you're more likely to be successful as an individual business or as the whole industry if you know and manage what's important to the people who impact your success. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do. It is a very strategic and powerful process. And the value drivers of all of that, again, whether it's an industry or whether it's a single company, are always pretty much the same. If you're more attuned to what's important to your stakeholders and you're more in tune to economic and societal and environmental changes, then you're more aware of risks and opportunities. You also have increased productivity, both because you're doing more with less, but also because you have a culture of looking at things differently and being aware, and that has a real innovation dividend. And thirdly, and increasingly, market access is a big driver of this. Increasingly, customers of food and fiber, but also any other commodity around the world, looking for evidence of sustainable impacts within their supply chains. So that's Sustainability 101. How does that all come together for us in the cotton industry? Every year we release, as most organizations do that take sustainability seriously, an annual update. I prefer to keep these really concise because a sustainability report is often seen as the be all and end all, but really a sustainability report is an output of the process. It's a tactic that I spoke about on the previous page. So we keep it really concise, but we have a lot more detail on an online Excel database. So if people want more detail, you've got all the indicators, links to the data sources, assumptions, methodology, additional notes are there. Okay, so we're trying to be as transparent as possible in what we do. Following that process, previously I spoke about, inclusivity, materiality. We've identified what's most important in terms of environmental, social, and economic. Everything we do is aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're working right now and over the next year or so to develop much more specific, non-arbitrary, ideally science-based, as in capital SB, the formal methodology, science-based targets, or if that's not feasible, at least small SB, small science-based targets, so that we know we're operating within the thresholds we need to have healthy ecosystems, healthy societies, healthy economies. Every year in that sustainability report, you'll see that we very clearly and transparently report how we've gone year on year, but also over 5 years, and where we have data for much longer. The reason for that is that in agricultural industries, a lot of the things that happen are outside your control, and there can be fluctuations or up or down that are not really a result of your direct actions. They're more sort of things that, whether it's environmental or market-based. In the cotton industry, we see the longer you look at data, generally, the trend is pretty positive. Having said that, obviously everyone has to improve. We are as well, and whenever we are not going in the direction we want to, we look to address that and are transparent about why. Data is at the heart of really all sustainability, and for agricultural industries, whether it's an industry framework like ours or the sustainability program, if you like, of a multinational company that's sourcing commodities from a global supply chain, data is the real weakness as well, because it's so hard to get good social and environmental data from complex global supply chains. In the past, our approach in the cotton industry and all the other agricultural frameworks in Australia has been to have almost a grab bag of indicators for our material topics. So whether that's from the Global Reporting Initiative, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, a few ISSB indicators, a few beef indicators for us, a few cotton specific, they all sort of come together it works, it's solid, it's okay, but it's all a little bit arbitrary and a little bit ad hoc. In the past couple of years, out of the ridiculous number of sustainability frameworks and standards which companies and financial institutions around the world use to guide how they measure and manage sustainability, there's been a few that we think have emerged as the ones that we think are most likely to be used by customers of food and fibre in Australia, around the world in future. Things like the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is providing disclosures for climate and general sustainability. Things like the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures and Science-Based Targets for Nature. So we think, rather than looking at and trying to keep everyone happy, we're going to align our framework much more closely to those handful of key standards. So now we still have our material topics, but we have the indicators that are within those frameworks for soil, water, and native veg condition, and the indicators for impacts and dependencies for all of those indicators, for all those topics, sorry. And the logic and the hope here is that if we have a single database that has all the data for the indicators and metrics which are required by customers of food and fibre, then we can use that single source of data for multiple purposes. First of which is to make it easier for our customers to actually buy our produce. We know that customers working in multinationals around the world, customers around the world, or in financial institutions, whether you're in Mumbai or Montreal or Melbourne, you're time poor, you're busy, you often don't have a great knowledge of environmental or agricultural practices. And when someone drops on your desk the 800 plus pages of the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures, then the immediate reaction is, well, how am I going to do this? It's really hard to get this stuff from global complicated supply chains. Our hope is we can say, well, here is the data you need at an industry level for the Australian cotton industry. It's not perfect. Here's the links to where the data comes from. Here's an assessment of the data quality. Here's our pathway to improve over time. But we hope it's a very simple way for companies and others to start to use that. We're looking, so that's a big value add of this work we're doing currently for customers. The big value add for farmers is working with the Queensland government, one of our states here in Australia, to use that same data to assess put a financial value, if you like, on selected impacts and dependencies using the Natural and Social Capital Protocol. So we can tell farmers year on year what's happening on average. We can tell them what's happening on their farm, or they can. But a real big value add will be to say, well, here's what's costing you, or here's the money you've made in terms of practices that improve soil health or impact native vegetation, et cetera, and looking to many other purposes as well. This is a work in progress. It's not perfect, but we're sharing what we do transparently with other industries here in Australia. Here's what it looks like. It's on our website. There's a lot of other work behind it, but basically it's a big database. We highlight gaps. We're working with other industries and with partners like TERN to try and fill in those data gaps so that hopefully everyone in agriculture can use the same indicators, the same data sources, and we can look to measure the same thing and improve data quality over time. I'll just finish off with a couple of slides on talking to net zero and biodiversity, which Peter and Tanya spoke about. First on greenhouse gases and net zero, the first thing I just want to highlight is this figure down here. So the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions of growing cotton, of processing it, and of shipping it to port are about 0.2% of Australia's greenhouse gases. I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of the fact, and I think we often do, probably because of some very clever lobbying, but climate change hasn't been caused by agriculture. It's been caused by burning fossil fuels. And it will be stopped by stopping burning fossil fuels, or at least by stopping the emissions going from fossil fuel consumption, whether that's by carbon capture and use for industrial processes or whatever. So the cotton industry and other agricultural industries have to play their part, no doubt, and we are. But when it's 0.2% of Australia's greenhouse gases, to me, there are much greater impacts and dependencies we have as an industry that we should be focusing on ahead of greenhouse gases. But we do look at this very, very closely because it's just so important for society, of course. In terms of pathways to reduce emissions, about 70% of emissions this is on-farm emissions of growing cotton, come from fertilizer, specifically nitrogen fertilizer. So as you'd be aware, plants need nitrogen to grow. When the crop is harvested and taken off for processing, that nitrogen has to be put back into the soil, or the soil quality declines. Typically, that fertilizer has come from synthetic fertilizer, nitrogen, which is manufactured through a very energy-intensive process. So the pathway to reduce pre-farm fertilizer emissions is by replacing fossil fuel energy with hydrogen or some other green source. If we can do that, and that's probably at least 2030 away before it becomes commercially viable, but this figure here comes down to zero. Okay, there's a lot of things we can do on farm to reduce fertilizer, but it should be noted again that whether it's crop residues, which is 6%, or having less more efficient use of fertilizer on farm, whether nitrogen comes from synthetic nitrogen or from cow manure or from legumes or whatever it might be, there is still greenhouse gases being produced from the natural processes of nitrogen reacting with soil and water and atmosphere. So there will always be emissions from farm. So if we can get fossil fuels out of our diet, we get rid of electricity, fuel, and pre-farm fertilizer emissions. To do more than that, we need to look at afforestation and other areas. I'm just going to skip on now because I think we're running out of time, but I just want to talk quickly about biodiversity and native vegetation. So we focus on native vegetation, biodiversity really big and complex and moves around. Native veg, at least it stands still. And for the past couple of years, we've been working with the natural resource management areas where cotton is grown. So Australia is fortunate to have a network of 54 NRM regions across the entire country who have strategic plans for managing biodiversity in each region. On the logic that biodiversity changes by region, it makes sense to us to partner with these NRM organisations to prioritise and develop regionally specific targets aligned to their identified priorities. Looking at our previous work, we've worked with our NRM organisations to choose indicators that our customers are likely to use, to have consistent indicators and terminology. And finally, we're hoping to develop a working model to have regional hubs. Peter again spoke about the noise and inconsistency. We would love for farmers everywhere in Australia to have a single one-stop shop to go to. So that if they want to do something on their farms to improve biodiversity or native veg, they go to this single place and they're told exactly what to do on their farm that will most contribute to regional outcomes. There's coordination of action and support. And if we can make this work for native veg in cotton, we can make it work for soil and water and other sources of social capital in cotton. And we can make this work for natural and social capital in cotton, better targeting resources and having regionally appropriate actions on each farm, then we can scale it across to other industries as well. So that's it. Thank you very much for your time. And I'll hand back to Beryl, sorry.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Peter, and thanks, Tanya. There are some questions that came up in the Q&A, and I'll just quickly put one to Tanya about whether species make a difference in whether we have healthy or not actual evapotranspiration. Really quickly, Tanya.
Yeah, really quickly. Thanks, Roger. Yes, there is difference between actual evapotranspiration between species. However, with the machine learning method we use, the different remote sensing layers we are able to bring in around climate really help to take out that variability so that one model predicted ET for both species.
Thank you for that. And we also have, if anyone's looking at the Q&A, you'll see that there were some answers by Peter, who hasn't yet turned his camera back on. And Tanya, if you can put your camera on. There were some interesting questions about the impacts of El Nino and El La Nina and things like that, but we'll let you read the answer. Joe Owens has also asked a question about more flux towers into agricultural land uses, so cotton, grains, grazing, etc. I think the answer is yes on that one. We're trying to do that, and the new CRC for net zero is also getting involved in that one. So we might just leave that one, because I have a question that I want to ask all three of you. So Chris, you want fit for purpose, simple, inexpensive data in order to get your land users to get involved. But I heard from Peter and Tanya that we need multiple sources of monitoring. We need, there are a lot of parameters involved that different sites aren't the same. So panel, what do you think? How do we get towards providing something simple to people? And Peter, you mentioned we need a common language, so that would be a start. But how do we get the ultimate dashboard that people go into it at, you know, like a weather report or something like that, when in fact our environment is really complex?
So for me, Beryl, the answer to that is yes, we first need common indicators and metrics for those core natural capital elements, if you like, soil, water, native vegetation, whatever biodiversity. And then I talk about information grade data and investment grade data. This has been a light bulb moment for me in this process, that we get where these things always fall down is we get caught up in having to have perfect data, and that takes a long time, and so nothing happens. Our hope is that we can all agree on consistent indicators in Australia, but also internationally, and we start with what we've got, and then we look to improve over time. So yes, we start with data that's information grade. It's not great, but it's good enough to tell a story over time. And then the work that Tanya and Peter and others at TERN do fills into that over time.
Any comments?
I'd have to agree with Chris completely on that one. We tend to look at data from a researcher point of view. What do I need to write a paper? And it's got to be bulletproof in so many different areas. And I think we need to get away from that. But there's also a question, or a philosophical question there for me, which is, why does TERN exist? Because if we're going to start narrowing down on a particularly small range of uses of the data and get quite specific about just what information do they need and just how much of it do they actually need, then are we going to lose sight of other things that we should be doing? So there's some real juggling to be done there in terms of what can we achieve with limited resources. If we get too specific, we might lose sight of some bigger picture things.
Yeah,
but talking to the end users has got to be what we start doing.
And that's what Chris had on his slide about inclusivity, getting the conversations going. Tanya, did you have a comment at all?
Yeah, I did. And I do agree totally with use what we've got around the world. I'm a very pragmatic approach to any science I undertake. In terms of what I'm thinking in data in the future is we do need that innovation in our sensors so that they become much cheaper and much less time intensive. And in terms of evapotranspiration, that is really starting to happen. So then we can develop big sensor networks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, speakers. You have been fantastic. There've been some great questions coming through. We haven't got to all of them, but you can always contact us at TERN as you, if you think of things that you want answered. Just share my screen for a second, because I just want to tell you that we're back again on the first Wednesday of next month, and we're going to be talking about Australia's coastal ecosystems, where most of us actually live or rely on. And so we do look forward to seeing everyone there. And in the meantime, I will say thank you to everyone. It's been splendid. Don't forget, we have a recording and it will be sent out in a couple of days' time so that you can catch up on everything. Thank you.